This was not simply a conflict of muddy dugouts and heavy guns. It was not exclusively waged with blades and razor wire. The Great War was fundamentally a fiscal conflict, one contested in treasury vaults, in securities exchanges and national banks, and in the private chambers of monetary controllers who never witnessed combat. The infantrymen sacrificed in crimson and flesh. But the financiers and state officials, they were computing ledgers and profit calculations. And what they engineered in those catastrophic years not only decided who triumphed and who surrendered, it also fundamentally restructured the planetary monetary architecture in methods that continue ensnaring you presently. If you believe warfare is purely about diplomacy and military forces, reconsider. The first global conflict demonstrated conclusively that capital is an armament, and among the most lethal ever conceived. In 1914, the continent was already an explosive situation ready to detonate. State competitions, imperial desires, and complex defense pacts had converted the landmass into a game board of mutual distrust. But underneath all the elaborate declarations about dignity and dominion, there existed a harsh economic truth. Conflict on this massive magnitude was unachievable to wage without incomprehensible quantities of capital. And here lies the merciless reality that nobody wished to confront. When rulers selected warfare, they were simultaneously selecting obligation. Every kingdom mobilizing its forces to the combat zone was concurrently mobilizing its population into a destiny of overwhelming fiscal weight. Yet at the commencement of this devastating struggle, most administrations assumed it would be brief, potentially concluded by year's end. They imagined they could fund it the traditional method with bullion stockpiles, with modest credit, with nationalist contributions from affluent subjects. Within just a handful of weeks, that comfortable fantasy shattered like fragile glass. The combat was consuming capital more rapidly than anyone could conceivably predict. Let us be exact about what was transpiring. In the midsummer of 1914, the monetary framework of the continent still centered around the bullion benchmark, an arrangement that had regulated international commerce for numerous decades. States guaranteed that their paper currency could be converted for genuine physical precious metal at any instant, an arrangement that provided money legitimacy and reliability, but also gravely restricted the capacity of administrations. Bullion stockpiles were limited and quantifiable. You could not simply manufacture indefinitely without forfeiting the confidence of your population and your lenders. The British Empire, the French Republic, and the German Reich all possessed adequate stockpiles at the conflict's beginning. But once countless men were assembled and manufacturing was entirely redirected to armament creation, the expenditures exploded beyond all forecasts. The German state alone was expending beyond 10 million currency units per rotation by autumn 1914, a number that appeared unbelievable at the period. And Britain's combat expenditures would shortly achieve 2.5 million sterling every single rotation, a bleeding of prosperity that no peacetime system could maintain. The arithmetic was ruthless and uncompromising. The precious metal would not endure through an extended struggle. Therefore, the administrations broke the regulations, one following another. Individually, the significant authorities silently discarded the bullion benchmark, fundamentally confessing to their populations that capital was presently nothing beyond a guarantee supported by confidence in the sovereign. And that instant, the severing of the precious metal tether, was among the most significant fiscal transformations in contemporary chronicle. It exposed how delicate the alleged genuine prosperity of kingdoms actually existed. Capital and authority were presently liberated from valuable ore and propelled instead by manufacturing machines, obligation expansion, and collective persuasion. And once administrations sampled that intoxicating liberty, they never genuinely reversed. The spirit was released from confinement. The fiscal conflict presently commenced earnestly, contested on invisible territories. For the German Empire, separated from planetary capital exchanges and besieged by the British naval forces, the sole practical alternative was enormous internal credit. The capital initiated surge after surge of security campaigns, petitioning to nationalism and state survival, pressing common subjects to deposit their existence reserves into combat obligations. The persuasion was persistent and advanced. Images of valiant infantrymen protecting the homeland, households pressed to relinquish comforts and luxuries for the kingdom, and perpetual guarantees that contributors would be generously compensated after certain triumph. In aggregate, the German state accumulated beyond 100 billion currency units, this method from its own inhabitants. But it was a structure constructed wholly on expectation and fantasy. When capitulation ultimately arrived in 1918, those securities were completely valueless. Countless Germans witnessed their existence reserves eliminated instantaneously, and that intense resentment became productive soil for radicalism in the approaching decades. Fiscal Chronicle always produces profound wounds that mold governance for successive periods. The British Empire, by comparison, possessed one tremendous benefit that demonstrated conclusive. The financial district of the capital was still the monetary center of the planet in 1914. British currency was internationally relied upon, and British monetary connections extended across every landmass. Initially, the administration depended substantially on brief-duration credit, governmental notes, and nationalist petitions to prosperous subjects. But very rapidly it accessed the more profound reserves of planetary obligation. Decisively, it oriented to America, an ascending fiscal authority across the ocean. In 1914, the American state was formally impartial in the struggle, but its monetary controllers instantly detected remarkable possibility. Corporations like Morgan's Enterprise and competing establishments became the fiscal support of the British and French, organizing enormous obligations and supervising acquisitions of armaments, provisions, and unprocessed resources. By 1917, when the American state itself participated in the combat, the financial district had already been financing the Allied endeavor for multiple years, accumulating riches in the procedure. This was not generosity or principle. This was deliberate authority. American monetary controllers accumulated countless units in charges and percentages, and America materialized from the combat utterly converted from obligated kingdom to lender, from a fiscal adherent to a planetary commander. If you question how the 20th period became the American period, this is exactly where it originates. Not on the combat territories of northern France or eastern Belgium, but in the accounting books of the eastern metropolis. The French Republic confronted its own urgent fiscal predicaments. Already diminished by the tremendous expenditures of constructing its protective structures and wounded by the recollection of the earlier Prussian conflict, it depended substantially on obligations, both internal and international. French subjects, extended recognized throughout the continent as enthusiastic preservers and contributors, were convinced through concentrated persuasion to acquire governmental securities. But much of the more profound financing again originated from across the ocean. The French state, like the British, became progressively reliant on American capital, establishing a connection that would mold post-war governance. This reliance would become a foundation of disagreement after the combat when tremendous obligations appeared and compensation became a hostile foundation of strain. When you learn about the period between conflicts, fiscal emergency of the successive decades, recall that it was not exclusively about compensations or exchange collapses. It was fundamentally about the devastating burden of obligation gathered during these 4 rotations of mechanical carnage. In the meantime, the Russian Empire's fiscal combat was an absolute catastrophe from the beginning. The domain was enormous in geography but financially primitive. Its monetary framework was delicate and its bullion stockpiles, while remarkable on documents, were inadequate in application for a contemporary mechanical conflict. To finance its combat endeavor, the Russian state credited substantially from its confederates, especially the French state, which had contributed billions in Russian securities before 1914. But as martial capitulations accumulated and price increases exploded beyond regulation, confidence in Russian currency dissolved entirely. By 1917, the Russian system was in complete devastation, with insufficiencies of everything from grain to combustible. The governance arrangement accompanied it, disintegrating under the burden of fiscal collapse. The dissolution of the imperial administration was not exclusively about insurrectionary philosophy or incompetent military commanders. It was fundamentally about a monetary framework extended beyond its fracture threshold. Fiscal errors, currency disorder, and uncontrolled price increases assisted in igniting insurrection and internal combat. Once more, capital and authority progressed together into the documents of Chronicle, indivisible. The magnitude of the fiscal dedication was absolutely overwhelming and without precedent. By the conclusion of the combat in 1918, the Allied authorities had expended beyond $140 billion, while the Central authorities had expended approximately $60 billion. These were quantities the planet had genuinely never witnessed previously, equivalent to numerous periods the aggregate pre-combat state revenues of the participants. The consequence was not exclusively mountains of uncompensatable obligation, but also the total annihilation of the previous fiscal structure that had regulated the planetary system. The bullion benchmark, once regarded the unbreakable basis of planetary confidence and trade, was destroyed beyond restoration. Price increases devastated through systems like a disease. The German state would shortly confront price increases so severe that a grain product cost billions of currency units and individuals combusted money to warm their dwellings. And common individuals, laborers, modest preservers, humble contributors were the ones who compensated the cost. The prosperous classes, in the meantime, often safeguarded themselves magnificently by relocating possessions internationally, by acquiring genuine physical commodities, by remaining proximate to the centers of authority where essential intelligence escaped initially. The instruction was merciless, but transparent as crystal. In a fiscal combat, the modest preserver hemorrhages initially and hemorrhages most extensively. And here exists the decisive connection that concerns you presently, at this instant. The Great War was the pivotal instant when administrations discovered they could finance the inconceivable by separating capital from tangible existence. They uncovered that they could halt bullion transformation, manufacture money perpetually, distribute securities to their own subjects with nationalist petitions, credit across international boundaries, and then repair the devastation subsequently with persuasion and fiscal reorganization. Does this resonate as recognizable? Because the strategy has never vanished, never been discarded. Every contemporary emergency, from the economic collapse to the planetary fiscal disaster of 2008 to the disease expenditure of 2020, possesses distinct resonances of 1914. When administrations or national monetary authorities insist that currency expansion is momentary, that the fiscal foundations are reliable, recall that in 1914 they were articulating exactly the same comforting declarations, and countless trusted them entirely, precisely until the money in their possession was valueless material. When the armaments ultimately ceased in the final month of 1918, the planet appeared like a combat zone, not exclusively in tangible excavations, but in state accounting documents. America, which had been an obligated kingdom substantially reliant on continental capital before the combat, presently possessed the planet's most substantial bullion stockpiles and held the most substantial lender situation in documented chronicle. The continent, the previous pulsating center of planetary commerce for periods, was submerging in obligation commitments. The British Empire was indebted to America beyond $4 billion, a quantity that appeared almost incomprehensible. The French state was indebted beyond $3 billion, and even smaller kingdoms were hopelessly entangled in commitments they could never practically compensate in their existences. The combat had converted the financial district into the new undisputed monetary capital of the sphere, replacing the British capital in a method no military or maritime power could have accomplished. The era of American supremacy in capital and planetary authority had conclusively commenced. But this was not a seamless or tranquil transformation, because here exists the malicious snare. When combats are financed predominantly by credit rather than direct levies, compensation becomes its own merciless combat. The British and French states, urgent to maintain confidence with their subjects who had nationalistically acquired combat securities, presently had to extract enormous quantities of capital out of vanquished Germany in the configuration of devastating compensations. The peace agreement demanded an astronomical quantity from the German state, 132 billion bullion currency units, a number so substantial it resisted understanding. It was constructed to discipline, to incapacitate, and to transfer the whole weight onto the vanquished authority. But it was also a total fantasy with no foundation in fiscal actuality. The German state simply could not compensate such quantities without annihilating itself. Every urgent attempt to execute so, whether through manufacturing currency or conveying commodities and unprocessed resources, destabilized its system even more. The price increases of 1923, when Germans transported wheelbarrows of valueless notes exclusively to acquire a grain product, was not some arbitrary mishap or natural catastrophe. It was the immediate and foreseeable result of a monetary framework pressed to the absolute boundary by unachievable obligation commitments. And it cultivated seeds of fury, degradation, and bitterness that governance radicals would subsequently harvest with annihilating consequence. In the meantime, the British Empire was attempting urgently to restore its diminishing fiscal reputation by returning to the bullion benchmark in 1925, anchoring their currency at its previous pre-combat worth. But this was another fiscal error of genuinely overwhelming dimensions. The British system had been annihilated by 4 rotations of absolute combat, its mechanical foundation diminished, its trade exchanges forfeited, its obligations ascending over subsequent periods. Restoring their currency at its previous equivalence was like compelling a fractured appendage back into situation without any restoration procedure. The consequence was foreseeable: price reductions, extensive joblessness, workforce unrest, and fiscal stagnation. The strategy, advocated by personalities like the later Prime Minister who subsequently confessed it was an error, is presently recalled as among the most inferior fiscal miscalculations in contemporary fiscal chronicle. And again, common laborers in their households were the ones who compensated the cost through forfeited employment and devastated existence standards, while classes clung urgently to the fantasy of restored state magnificence. America, abundant with bullion stockpiles and international obligation, confronted a distinct but comparably demanding inquiry: what to execute with this new, overwhelming supremacy. American monetary institutions commenced depositing capital back into the continent in the subsequent decade, crediting to the German state so that Germany could compensate compensations to the British and French states, who could then compensate back their combat obligations to America. It was a peculiar fiscal circulation that appeared reliable on the exterior but was constructed wholly on circular reasoning and presumptions. The compensation arrangements of the mid-decade and subsequent decade institutionalized this circulation of capital. Money was being reprocessed perpetually, not actually established or acquired. And when the planetary system trembled to a cessation in the economic collapse after 1929, the whole artificial framework dissolved like a construction of materials. The planet had never been more fiscally interconnected through obligation and credit, and never more hazardously delicate. This is exactly why the Great War is not exclusively another dusty section in Martial Chronicle publications. It was a basic transformation threshold in Fiscal Chronicle where monetary errors and hazardous fantasies reshaped the whole destiny of the sphere. The combat demonstrated conclusively that administrations could discard bullion benchmarks, expand currencies at discretion, and credit on and without precedent magnitude, and yet still effectively convince their subjects that they were executing the correct and essential action. It demonstrated that persuasion could skillfully convert obligation into nationalism, that common preservers could be persuaded to surrender their prosperity for securities that would never be compensated, and that the genuine victors of contemporary combat were often those who occupied in enterprise conference chambers and monetary chambers, not those who contested and perished in muddy excavations. Capital and authority were combined more rigidly than ever previously in human chronicle, and the sphere has existed with the intense results ever afterward. Presently, contemplate carefully about your existence presently, at this instant, when national monetary authorities guarantee that present price increases are simply momentary, when administrations expand obligation limits rotation after rotation without evident restriction, when new capital is materialized electronically at the movement of an input device. Recall 1914. Recall that the bullion benchmark was not discarded by mishap or natural progression, but by intentional construction in an instant of urgent emergency. Recall that the configuration of crediting recklessly against the destiny of manufacturing capital to conceal present commitments, of distributing securities enclosed in nationalist declarations, is beyond a period previous and intensely embedded. Every substantial fiscal emergency of the contemporary era possesses foundations extending back to those combat rotations. From the price increases of the seventh decade to the mortgage dissolution of 2008 to the disease expenditure of 2020, the same hazardous fantasies are still at operation, and the same individuals, the common preserver, the middle-tier laborer, the modest contributor, are still the ones requested to relinquish their prosperity and protection. The concealed fiscal contest behind the Great War is not a dusty artifact of the previous era, securely contained in chronicle publications. It is the basis of the present monetary framework you exist beneath. The instruction is severe but absolutely essential to comprehend. Capital, once liberated from tangible existence and restriction, becomes a powerful instrument of manipulation and regulation. Administrations will always discover methods to finance combats, to finance rescues, to finance any emergency they consider significant. And they will always discover clever methods to make you compensate for it, whether through immediate levies, through price increases that corrodes acquisition capability, or through the gradual corrosion of your reserves and destiny protection. Genuine prosperity is not exclusively numbers on a display or guarantees from governance officials and national monetary controllers. Genuine prosperity is endurance, applicable comprehension, and the capability to perceive through comforting fantasies. That is the exclusive, authentic fiscal liberty that Chronicle permits. And here exists the concluding contemplation to depart with you this evening. Chronicle does not duplicate itself exactly, expression for expression, but it does resonate repeatedly and repeatedly. The fiscal strategy inscribed in crimson and notation in 1914 has been utilized repeatedly afterward, attired in new contemporary language, presented with new advanced justifications. But the result is always fundamentally the identical. Those in situations of authority safeguard themselves and their concerns initially, and those without comprehension and consciousness are relinquished. If you acquire anything significant from this narrative, permit it be this decisive instruction. Never presume capital is genuine and reliable exclusively because it is formally manufactured. Never presume the monetary framework is fundamentally reliable exclusively because the authorities confidently articulate so. The actuality is always carefully concealed in the accounting documents and the minute notation, and Chronicle is the exclusive instructor that does not falsify to serve its own concerns. If this provided you a new viewpoint on how the sphere genuinely operates, activate subscription. Chronicle possesses the solutions they do not desire you to locate.